When we look at the beginnings of philosophy in the Western world, we will have to begin with the pre-Socratic era. Now, the period of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle is known as the classical period, and it was roughly from BC 500 to BC 330, roughly. But philosophy had begun even before this, and that is known as the pre-Socratic era. We'll come to this presently. Let us look at logic, reason. Now, logic and reason and any kind of analysis based on logic and reason first began in Greece when we speak of the Western world. It began in Greece. So now, based on logic and reason, some kind of analysis was made and some meaningful conclusions drawn. Now, these meaningful conclusions were drawn, and it was all done, that whole analysis using reason and logic, it was all done without any objective evidence. What is objective evidence? Things which can be observed and measured, those are what we call objective evidence. But in Greece, reason and logic were being used to analyze some things for which there was no available, information. There was no set of information available. Anything that we could call maybe data, that was not available. And so there was no objective evidence. Yet analysis is going on. Now, this kind of analysis, where there is no objective evidence, that is called philosophy. Now, with time, what happened was a kind of distinction came in. Now, reason and logic and analysis based on these were being done, but there was data available. There was objective evidence, which means that they could be observed, they could be measured. And so this kind of analysis and matters relating to all these came to be known as science. So the difference between philosophy and science is that both are using reason and logic, but in the case of philosophy, there is no objective evidence. Analysis is being made using reason and logic, but without an objective evidence. They are going to talk of things which cannot be observed, which cannot be measured. That is philosophy. And when objective evidence is there and they are going to be able to observe it and to measure and things, they are going to call it science. Now, religion also does something similar to what philosophy does. In the case of religion too, there is no objective evidence. There is no objective evidence, and so religion is in many ways similar to philosophy, yet they are not the same. In the case of philosophy, logic and reason are the guiding things. Whereas in the case of religion, here too there is no objective evidence, similar to, philosophy, no objective evidence there too, but logic and reason are being used there. In the case of religion, what is being used? Faith and belief. So now you have the word of God, you have the scriptures where the divine mind is transmitting knowledge through sound or through some other form to the human mind. So this was the distinction between religion and philosophy. Logic and reason was being used there, no objective evidence. Philosophy. Faith and belief are being used here, no objective evidence. This is religion. And objective evidence available, measurable, replicable, observable, all this becomes science. Now, philosophy studies 4 things. Actually, it studies 3 things, but in order to make it simpler for us to understand, we look at it as 4 things. Philosophy studies existence, and we call it metaphysics. Then philosophy studies knowledge, and we call it epistemology. Philosophy studies morals, we call it ethics. And philosophy studies beauty, and we call it aesthetics. Now let us go to the pre-Socratic times, and we will have to look at this great figure called Parmenides. Parmenides was the first person to take up that, internal position. So there's something innate, internal. That is the position that Parmenides took up. He made a very famous statement saying, nothing at all changes in the world. When actually, on a daily basis, we are able to get evidence of things changing. What was yesterday is in a changed form today. Yet Parmenides made that very meaningful statement that nothing in the world changes at all. By that, he meant that there is a world of perfection. It exists within, and Parmenides was the first to study the mind. So it exists in the mind, and that perfect state, that world in its perfect state, in its state of fullness and perfection, exists within. And so there is a perfect state, and there is a state of the world in which we are receiving evidence through the physical senses regularly, on a moment-to-moment basis, on a daily basis. And Parmenides felt that evidence received through the 5 senses could not be wholly trusted there was something far more to this. There was something far more than what we can see with the help of these 5 senses. So Parmenides was the first rationalist. Now, the opposite of rationalism is empiricism. Rationalism, reason, logic, even if there is no objective evidence, this is rationalism. And then we have empiricism, in which that available data has to be there, observable things have to be there. That is the empiricist position. Now, after Parmenides, we will come to Socrates. And Socrates was a rationalist. Socrates had the belief that there is that innate state of perfection, and he believed that knowledge is not something that you can hand over to someone. People have to arrive at knowledge. It's an internal thing. They can be coaxed. They can be urged to arrive at that correct understanding, to arrive at truth. And this is what Socrates believed. He was a rationalist. Now, we come to know of things related to Socrates through the dialogues of Plato. He was the most renowned disciple of Socrates, and we get to know everything about Socrates through Plato. Plato was a rationalist too. And Plato too believed in that innate, the perfected, something that exists in a perfect form, and the evidence that the senses bring you are less than that perfect state which exists within. This was Plato's view. That's how, central to Plato's teachings is the theory of forms. So there is a pure and perfect form already existing, and everything else that you see in the world is an approximation of that perfect thing. It's an approximation. Now, how do we understand this? Let's look at it with the help of a very, very simple example. Now, there's a home science practical examination going on, and there are 10 students here, and these 10 students have got to make dosa. So now there is a recipe for a perfect dosa. There is a recipe. That's in the abstract form. Now these 10 students are going to make that dosa. They are using the exact thing, they are using the exact proportions, they are doing they are using the same ingredients, they are using everything as they ought to use it, whatever. But the dosas that those 10 students come up with, each is unique in itself, and each may be good in itself, and each may be whatever, but they are approximations of that recipe called dosa. So something like that, a concept, an idea which exists in an abstract form, and then they have approximations of that idea which exist as manifestations of the form. And this was Plato's view, and Plato was a rationalist in his approach, and he believed in this innateness. After Plato came Aristotle, and we have to remember the fundamental difference between Plato and Aristotle is that Plato was a rationalist and Aristotle was an empiricist. He didn't talk of some world of perfection, the world of forms. In fact, in a way, he disregarded Plato's theory of forms. He didn't think of any pure and perfect state. He said that the world is. It is because it is. It's not an approximation, it's not a shadow, nothing of the sort. It just is as it is. And the world needs to be systematically, methodically, intelligently studied. That is the job of the scholar. You have to look at the world as it is. Study that. And then he came up with that theory of the poet studying the world and then using creative imagination and creating that world differently in poetry. That's what Aristotle said. But right now we are just looking at Aristotle for philosophy. And so Aristotle did not agree with the theory of forms, but Aristotle had this concept of the four causes. Now, the concept of the four causes is important when we look at Aristotle. And causes here doesn't mean reason. Causes here mean aspects, not reason. Now, let's look at it this way. Suppose there's an animal. So, in the case of the animal, the first cause of what material is it made? That's the first cause. Whether you are looking at an animal or you're looking at a wooden chair, the first cause is the material of which it is made. So in the case of an animal, it is flesh, blood, bones. If you're looking at a chair, it is wood. So that's how. The second cause, the first cause is the material and the second cause is the form that it takes. So in the case of the animal, it has taken the form of an animal. In the case of the chair, it has taken the form of a piece of furniture, which you're calling a chair. That's the second cause, the form. The third cause is the cause of its existence or origin. How did it come into being in the first place? How did it come into existence? So in the case of the human being, the parents got together, they mated sexually, so the child arrived. That is the cause of the origin in the case of the human being. In the case of the chair, now there's a tree and then the wood from that tree. This is the third cause. And the final cause is the purpose of its existence. So in the case of a human being, that human being has to live, he has to grow, he has to thrive. He has all those purposes. And in the case of the chair, it has to be used for sitting purposes. So these were the four causes of Aristotle. And the difference between Aristotle and Plato is that Aristotle is empirical in his approach and Plato is a rationalist in his approach. Aristotle did not believe in any divine providence or something. He did speak of a prime mover, some supreme power. He spoke of a prime mover, but he didn't let that interfere in his philosophy or in the theory of art.